Hi, this is Elliot Cohen. Welcome back to Rough Magic, Shakespeare on Power. In previous lectures, we've talked about kings who become kings through some process of legitimate succession. We saw one king, Richard II, who was profoundly incompetent, therefore lost his crown and indeed his life. Another king, Prince Hal, who becomes Henry V, who is the very opposite. He goes through a real education. We talked about that education and becomes a successful king. In this lecture and several of those that follow, I would like to talk about what happens when people seize power illegally, or at least in a profoundly irregular and almost unnatural fashion. We're going to begin by talking about a coup. That is to say, when power is seized in a violent fashion, but it's not simply one ruffian trying to succeed another. So it's not like Macbeth, who just wants to be king, and so he's willing to kill the previous king. This is something different. This is the overthrow of an order, in this case, the dictatorship, soon to be perhaps the monarchy of Julius Caesar. And I would like to talk about two questions in the play Julius Caesar. First, why do the plotters do what they do? And the second is, and this is just as important, why is Caesar vulnerable to the plot? Because the plotters aren't going to succeed unless there's a vulnerability that they can exploit. Let's begin with Cassius, who is in many ways the ringleader, even though Brutus becomes the formal leader. Some people might think the figurehead, although I'm sure he didn't think of himself that way. He gives two reasons, Cassius does, for the decision to launch the coup. This is the first. Why, man, he, Julius Caesar, doth bestride the narrow world like a colossus, and we petty men walk under his huge legs and peep about to find ourselves dishonorable graves. Then famously, the fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves that we are underlings. So Cassius is in many ways putting the blame on political figures, aristocrats like Cassius and Brutus themselves, who are envious of the way in which Caesar bestrides the world. But he's mainly focused on the fact that because of Julius Caesar's overwhelming power, they are dishonored. They don't have the opportunity to distinguish themselves and win glory in the way that they would have earlier in the Republic. Later on in the play, Cassius changes his tune somewhat. He has a somewhat different explanation for why he wants to overthrow Caesar. Poor man, I know he would not be a wolf, but that he sees the Romans are but sheep. He were no lion, were not Romans hinds, and so on. So in other words, Cassius is indicting Caesar, to be sure, but he's indicting Rome. And this is a common theme in Shakespeare's Roman plays. He's writing a lot about Rome halfway between republic and monarchy. It's a corrupt republic in many ways. And although Brutus really, as we will see, would like to reform Rome, Cassius is reacting against a Rome that has allowed someone as despicable as he thinks Caesar is to seize power. And so he intends to overthrow Caesar, but it's not out of great love of the Roman Republic, which he refers to as trash, rubbish, and awful. Brutus is quite different. This is, again, quite early on in the play. And notice he begins by saying it must be by his death. He's already figured this one out. And for my part, I know no personal cause to spurn at him but for the general, in other words, the general cause. Brutus is insistent, first and foremost, that he has nothing against Caesar. It would be intolerable for Brutus to think that there was anything personal about this. Of course, one of the lessons of the play may be that, that old line from The Godfather, it's nothing personal, just business, is false, because in the movie The Godfather, it turns out everything is personal. There's no thing that's just business. Well, Brutus, I think, deceives himself here as well. And the second thing to note is his argument is problematic. He can't really identify anything that Julius Caesar has done that is particularly wrong. Instead, his thesis or his theory is the theory of the serpent's egg, that Julius Caesar's like a serpent's egg, and if you let it hatch, it will grow mischievous, in other words, dangerous, and so therefore we have to kill it now before he can turn into that. It's very different from someone like Calvin Coolidge, who famously said once that if you see 10 troubles coming your way, you can be sure that 9 of them will run into a ditch before they ever reach you. So the plotters all have very, very different motives. They may not even really know their own motives. I think that's probably particularly true of Brutus. And that's actually sets them up for various failures, as you see in the play. And that's an important point. But what about the way in which Caesar is vulnerable to this plot? And one has to say that Caesar is not portrayed in a particularly admirable way. For one thing, he's always talking about himself in the third person, which is somewhat unusual. But look at, for example, his last speech. The brother of a man that he has banished is urging him to rescind the banishment. And Caesar doesn't just say, well, let me think about it, or I'm afraid I just can't do that. He begins with an insult. I could be well moved if I were as you. In other words, if I were the lesser kind of man that you are as opposed to me. But I am constant as the northern star, of whose true fixed and resting quality there is no fellow in the firmament. This is appalling arrogance. And of course, he's going to end up paying for it. And he really has this view of himself, which is infuriating to men like Cassius who know him and who know his weaknesses, which Cassius, by the way, is quite careful to tell us about. Well, why do the plotters fail? There are many reasons, but I want to make reference to a play that we'll be looking at in a couple of lectures down the road, and that's Macbeth. And you may remember that Lady Macbeth has to persuade her husband to really screw up his courage to the sticking point, as she says, and murder King Duncan in his sleep. And while Macbeth is hesitating, she says the following: "What thou wouldst highly, that wouldst thou holily. Would not play false, and yet wouldst wrongly win." She puts her finger on it. Yes, you want to be king, you want to do this thing, but you want to have a clean conscience. That's really the story of Brutus, isn't it? Would not play false, yet wouldst wrongly win. Brutus never faces that. Macbeth does. Of course, Macbeth gets himself into a different set of troubles as a result. But Brutus, as we shall see, makes a number of terrible mistakes in dealing with the aftermath of the coup because he wants to win it holily, as Lady Macbeth says. And one of the lessons here, I believe, that Shakespeare can teach us is that when you violate order like this by staging a coup and murdering somebody, it doesn't all, you can't really do it in a way that's going to leave you with a clean conscience. And you have to think about the second and third order effects that necessarily follow. Well, with that in mind, I would like you to take a look at Macbeth, particularly the scenes that I've mentioned, and compare Macbeth to Brutus or even Cassius, who is a less principled figure. In our next session, we're going to talk about demagoguery. We'll talk about the famous scene around Caesar's corpse, where Brutus gives a speech which falls completely flat, and Mark Antony whips up the crowd against the conspirators and thereby sets the course for the rest of the play. See you later. Hello, this is Elliot Cohen. Welcome back to Rough Magic, Shakespeare on Power. In the previous lecture, we talked about the coup that was launched against Julius Caesar. We talked about why the plotters undertook it and why perhaps Julius Caesar himself was vulnerable to it. Now, there are other ways than waylaying somebody like Julius Caesar and stabbing him to death, whereby you can take power. And in this lecture, we're going to explore one of them, and that's sheer demagoguery. That's where you turn the mob against the established order, in this case, the new established order that was created by Brutus and the conspirators. Remember, this is a conspiracy of a very large chunk of the Senate. So it's not as if it's simply one or two ambitious men who've decided to take over the government. So what I would like to do is begin with Brutus, who immediately after the murder decides that he's going to try to sell the people on why they did this. And he starts by saying to all the conspirators, let's bathe our hands in Caesar's blood up to the elbows and just besmear our swords. Let's judge this by the Shakespearean test of political theater. Is this smart political theater? Well, in another part of Shakespeare, in Hamlet, Hamlet famously gives some very good advice to a bunch of actors. He says, suit the action to the word and the word to the action. Well, the words here are peace, freedom, and liberty. And the action is that you've soaked your hands up to the elbows in blood. And you have to wonder, does it occur to Brutus that maybe this is not the best symbolic gesture to win the crowd over? He goes on and gives a speech. Now, Brutus's speech is not given in iambic pentameter, it's in prose. It is serious, that's for sure, but it is clunky. It doesn't have drive, it doesn't have rhythm, it isn't particularly compelling. It's got some very stylized phrases, not that I loved Caesar less, but that I loved Rome more. As Caesar loved me, I weep for him. As he was fortunate, I rejoice at it. As he was valiant, I honor him. But as he was ambitious, I slew him. And he kind of moves through that parallel structure in a rather ponderous way. By the way, note something about Brutus's speech. It's all about him. There's no we. He doesn't really refer to the other conspirators at all. Hear me for my cause. Believe me for mine honor, and have respect to mine honor. Censure me in your wisdom. He just goes all the way through this, and it's all about Brutus. And furthermore, as he goes all the way through, he has these rhetorical questions, and that's a standard feature of his speech. But think about it. What he's doing is he's asking the rhetorical questions, and he isn't really trying to engage the audience. Who is here so base that would be a bondman? If any, speak, for him have I offended. Well, all you can get from an audience out of something like that is just silence, because who's going to say sure? And then he ends with this somewhat pompous conclusion. This is a truly terrible speech. Now, foolishly, Brutus turns down Cassius's advice to kill Mark Antony, who is really Caesar's best friend. Foolishly, he decides to leave the scene when they let Mark Antony give a speech at over Julius Caesar's corpse. And thereafter results some of the best demagogic speaking in Shakespeare, or indeed the English language. He begins by insinuating himself into the good graces of the crowd. He's not going to praise Caesar. He's going to bury him. He praises Brutus. And you'll notice, of course, that he insists that Brutus is an honorable man. And for Brutus is an honorable man, so are they all honorable men. And of course, there's great irony. He keeps on repeating that over and over again. And it becomes quite clear that he doesn't think they're honorable men in the slightest, but he's done it in quite an indirect way. It's very interesting. He's in some ways responding to Cassius's critique of Caesar, of Caesar's infirmities. And what he does is he takes that and he turns those into strengths. When that the poor have cried, Caesar hath wept. Ambition should be made of sterner stuff. Then there's a lot of theatrics here. My heart is in the coffin there with Caesar, and I must pause till it come back to me. Sometimes the most effective thing you can do in giving a speech is just be silent. Any of us who have engaged in public speaking knows that can be really hard. He moves the audience physically. Make a ring about the corpse of Caesar, and he actually comes down close to the body. He asks rhetorical questions which are going to get the mob saying things. You will compel me then to read the will? Well, no kidding. They're going to compel him to read the will because he's just told them that there are all kinds of goodies in the will for them. Shall I descend? And will you give me leave? Then he's brilliant in his use of props. See what a rent the envious casca made. So he's holding up the toga. And then, of course, very famously, the well-beloved Brutus stabbed. This was the most unkindest cut of all. Then he tries a very common ploy for a demagogue. I'm no orator, as Brutus is, but as you know me all, a plain, blunt man. Well, he's anything but a plain, blunt man. But that shtick is one that demagogues always use. I'm just a plain, simple person. I speak, the man in the streets language. I don't use fancy language. I don't use fancy rhetorical forms the way Brutus does. And that, of course, carries him very far. And then finally, he uses the most powerful props of all, Caesar's wounds. He shows them the wounds. Poor, poor, dumb mouths. Well, it's a brilliant scene, and it, of course, completely turns the situation around. The crowd had been more or less on the side of the conspirators. They go berserk. And that's important, too, because we have to think about what demagoguery then unleashes. And there's quite a chilling line at the end as Mark Antony sees what he has unleashed. Now let it work. Again, that short little sentence that Shakespeare will sometimes give us that says it all. Mischief thou art afoot, take thou what course thou wilt. Mark Antony knows that he's just lit a bunch of matches and he's tossing them into cans of kerosene. And that is in part the nature of demagoguery, that because what you're doing is you're inflaming a mob, all kinds of things will now become unpredictable. There'll be violence, and it can go in any kind of direction. And that's what Mark Antony wants. Remember, this is also the man who says, cry havoc and let's slip the dogs of war. And there's a little bit which sometimes gets overlooked where there's a poet named Cinna, who there was also a conspirator named Cinna, and the mob comes in and they get Cinna the poet. I'm not Cinna the conspirator, he says, and they kill him anyway. Tear him, and they do kill him. And I think it's Shakespeare's way of saying, this is what happens when you go down that path. And I think this really is an essential part of Shakespeare's teaching about these tools to acquire power, which can be very effective, but can have all kinds of unforeseen consequences. So here's what I would like you to do for the next lecture. But first, I think I'd like you to reflect on this lecture and look at the lines that the plebeians have. They don't get iambic pentameter, but they do have various observations. And it is interesting to see in Shakespeare what members of the crowd are like. Why do they say the things they do? What is their reading of the situation? Do they have a certain kind of common sense, or are they simply there to be molded by the aristocrats? And if you're familiar with the play Coriolanus, you might want to take a look at that as well. Well, next time we're going to talk about crime, about simple murder. And for that, there's nothing better than the Scottish play, of course, Macbeth. We'll look at the end of Act 1 and beginning of Scene 2. This is the point where Macbeth decides on the murder. And from this, everything else in the play follows. And I pose a couple of questions to you. Is he evil or merely easily tempted? Is he truly independent, or is he dominated by his wife? Is he impulsive or disciplined? Of course, those are either or questions. The truth may be somewhere in between. But I'll leave that for you to figure out. See you next time. Hello, this is Elliot Cohen. Welcome back to Rough Magic, Shakespeare on Power. We've been talking about various illegitimate ways to acquire power, and with this lecture we'll discuss the most illegitimate of them all, mere murder, crime. And the case will be, of course, Macbeth, where Macbeth, a nobleman who deserved well of his king, King Duncan, commits murder and replaces him. And of course, it ends pretty badly. There are two questions to explore here. Why does Macbeth commit the murder? And secondly, what are the consequences of seizing power by crime? Now, Macbeth is a complicated play in many ways, and one of them is that Macbeth himself is a very complicated character. He's not simply evil, like Iago in Othello or Richard III in the play of that name. He has some scruples, he hesitates, he is self-aware. So why does he commit the murder? What is it that allows him to do so? Well, I would say there are two clues. One is at the very beginning, when Duncan is told about Macbeth's success against the traitor MacDonald, and the messenger is reporting the final duel, hand-to-hand fight, which ne'er shook hands nor bade farewell to him till he unseamed him from the nave to the chops and fixed his head upon our battlements. The nave can either be the navel or the crotch, and the chops, of course, are the jaws. So think about that. That isn't. It's actually a more violent image than the sword coming crashing down from the head down. This is the sword coming up, and it's a pretty grisly picture. And of course, he puts the traitor's head on the fortress. The point here is this is a very violent man. He's capable of a great deal of violence. At the moment, it's controlled in support of his king, but perhaps not always. The second clue lies in the prophecy of the three weird sisters. All hail Macbeth, hail to thee, Thane of Glamis, hail to thee, Thane of Cawdor, all hail Macbeth that shalt be king hereafter. And what they're doing is they're using three titles. The title he currently has, the title that he ends up being given by the king, as Thane of Cawdor, and then that shalt be king hereafter. Well, how does Macbeth react to that? This supernatural soliciting cannot be ill, cannot be good. If ill, why hath it given me earnest of success, commencing in a truth? So in other words, he begins by saying, well, even though these are three pretty scary creatures, often referred to as witches, this can't be bad. Well, really? And the reason why is because they correctly predicted that he would become Thane of Cawdor. But it can't be entirely good, not because they're suggesting that he might do something terrible, but rather because there's something about what they're saying that makes me really, really uneasy. And here's the interesting thing. My thought, whose murder yet is but fantastical. This suggests that he may have already begun thinking about the murder of Duncan, but he just hadn't resolved on doing it. It made him uneasy. And so he's somewhat at a loss for what to do. The point is, this is not a man with a deeply fixed moral compass. Far from it. He has scruples, he has reservations, and we'll see those. But that's not what's making him move. He then makes the decision. If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly. It's very much a kind of a military leader's view of things. Let's act decisively. But he thinks about it because he's very smart. And he says, if the assassination could trammel up the consequence and catch with his Circe's success, that but this blow might be the be-all and end-all here. But here upon this bank and shoal of time, we jump the life to come. In other words, if by killing Duncan, that would be it, I would just be king and all would be good, then I wouldn't worry that much about the afterlife, divine punishment. But, and again, there's no moral constraint here. It's what I've learned is that we but teach bloody instructions, which being taught return to plague the inventor. So in other words, I know that if you do this kind of thing, then other people are going to try to do this kind of thing to you. And I know, moreover, that this is a real problem. I'm his kinsman. And then, he was a meek and virtuous guy. And that fact will make me extremely unpopular. He doesn't say that it's immoral. He doesn't say that it's wrong. He knows the consequences. So Macbeth is a highly rational, highly intelligent man who lacks something of a moral center. Certainly, he doesn't have the kind of moral compass that would just say, I'm not even going to think about this. And of course, he knows where this is going to go. We have scorched the snake, not killed it. And so he goes from murder to murder to murder, to include going after women and children, as well as other aristocrats. And he knows, again, because he's smart, he's going to pay a psychological price for this. He loses the ability to sleep. And he talks about this at some length, about that he talks about how sleep is a great restorative, and that I'm going to lose the ability to sleep. And this is a common theme in Shakespeare. Kings don't sleep easily. Uneasy lies the head that wears the crown. Henry IV and Henry V both talk about this, of course. And so he knows where this is going. And where does it take him? Well, at the end of the play, when his wife has died, and we know that it's a very close marriage, it's usually portrayed actually as sexually quite intense, but they are clearly a partnership together. He hears that she's died, and she's apathetic. She should have died hereafter. There would have been time for such a word. And then this famous speech, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. No, it's funny because this is not a man whose the pace of whose life has been petty at all. But that's where he is. It's a bleak, colorless world, and all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Again, there is Shakespeare's theatrical metaphor. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. I think the message for us in all this is that when you gain power by great crime, it eventually burns you out on the inside. In general, it seems to me most Shakespearean figures, when they have gained power, lose some of their humanity. And I think that's a pretty fair observation, actually, of the world as we know it. But it is particularly the case for someone who has gained power through crime, and above all, the crime of murder. And of course, in the end, that prize that he sought, the crown, doesn't exist. It doesn't even refer to as a crown. It's a title hanging loose about him like a giant's robe upon a dwarfish thief. He has nobody who supports him. He has nobody who loves him. He has nobody who will be with him. He is like Richard III at the end, utterly alone. And that too is in the nature of power, particularly power illegitimately gained. At the end, you are completely alone. Now, as you reflect on this lecture, I would like you to consider the possibility that Macbeth is not the only figure who's been seduced by power. And you may wish to go back and look at some of the other figures in the play, because you can certainly argue that they too, but in different ways, are seduced by power, including some of the good guys, like Malcolm. So you may want to think about that. For the next lecture, we're going to begin the third part of the course, which deals with the exercise of power. The theme is going to be inspiration, and we're going to discuss the most inspirational speech in Shakespeare, perhaps in the English language, and that's the St. Crispin's Day speech that King Henry V gives on the eve of the Battle of Agincourt. Please read it, enjoy it, and I look forward to speaking with you next time.